Listen, man, it is time that you pay homage to a real savior. We got the patron request from Sal. He says, Goetia destroying human history means what exactly? Is this strictly confined to the FGO universe or the whole Nasuverse? By the way, if you haven't already, make sure you guys sign up for the Patreon. You get access to early content and priority on your request. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna go through the entirety of Goetia's plan, because we've been needing to do that anyway. It is long overdue. And then I'll elaborate more on his question as we get more into it. So who is Goetia? You may have seen him around, but not exactly know the full extent of why he exists, how he became a beast of humanity, and why he decided that he needed to go against us. So we're gonna take it all the way back to the top, that being his origins, which stem from the servant Solomon. And when I say Solomon, I mean the same King Solomon from the Old Testament, the third king of Israel that was hand selected by God himself. Goetia is not just one of my favorite antagonists, but he's really good for the franchise overall. And he kind of encompasses all of the good things about FGO. His entire existence is just a clever play on Solomon's background. So back when Solomon was still alive, up until a point, he did everything that he was supposed to do, and eventually God came to him in a dream to give him his blessing. And out of all the nonsense that Solomon could have chosen, he told God that he wanted wisdom. He wanted the best possible knowledge that he could have that would lead his people in the right direction. To the point where even God was taken aback by this. He says, you know what? I'm gonna do you one better. And this is straight from Kings. He says, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall anyone like you arise after. Basically to say that there will never be anyone like Solomon. And since Solomon didn't ask for things that people normally wish for, like riches and fame, he was bestowed with those things anyway. And this wasn't just regular wisdom, this was infinite wisdom, at least to his capacity. That's a part of the reason why he has his clairvoyance, because he truly had it. The unfortunate part is that in the later half of Solomon's life, he deviated from the word, and by the time that he finally went down, he ended up being punished by God. And all of this starts to work into why Goetia is such a clever concept as a character. So after Solomon passes away, and this is supposed to be back around 900 BC, you have these works that come out after his death that attribute to him being a practitioner of spellcasting, works like the Testament, the Lesser, and the Greater Keys of Solomon. Now, he in particular had nothing to do with this, but since these were spoke up around his name, since his level of wisdom was often perceived as something beyond human understanding, it was viewed as sorcery, and it got wrapped into the mythos of his character in Fate. So in the Fate verse, he is now the actual king of magecraft, and he had his rings that embodied the idea of him being this conjurer, of him having connection with these good and evil spirits because of that wisdom. These spirits that were referred to in myth as angels and demons. In Fate, these would be the demon gods, the demon god pillars. So in verse, these demon gods continued to exist even after Solomon passed away, and they started to manifest inside of his corpse after his death. Since these spirits were attributed to be a part of Solomon's name, they function as a counterpart to Solomon. The problem is, since they lack humanity, they deal with and think about things in a very logical and straightforward way, one that lacks the usual empathy that you would expect from being human. They essentially took that same wisdom and knowledge that Solomon had over his people during his lifetime and pulled the humanity out of it. And these 72 spirits function in the same way. The way that Solomon looked over his people of Israel as the leading unit to the world itself is the same way that these spirits looked at the world that we have now, but they were disgusted by the way that we do business. They felt that we were inconsistent, that our heart was in the wrong place, that if they were head in charge, they could do a much better job. These 72 spirits all have their own conscience. They all have their own way of doing things, but ultimately their main goal as a unit was to save humanity. So they came together collectively inside of Solomon's body, and they went on the journey to start to rectify our wrongdoings, which we later come to find out that they call themselves Goetia. Goetia, the very name itself means to invoke angels and demons. years. And that's where the entirety of the part 1 story comes from. It was Goetia himself using Solomon's body as a vehicle to go throughout different points in human history that really mattered, whether that be the Roman Empire, one of the greatest empires to ever exist, all the way back to Mesopotamia, and he chose 7 points in human history in order to do this. His idea was that by finding different agents throughout time, he can use them as a nesting place, so to speak. And so he would implant these crests in one agent from each of these 7 periods, and they would slowly start to manifest over time and break the foundations of humanity. And this was a gradual process all the way from the time that Solomon went down. So from 900 BC until the story that we get now, which originally started in 2015 on the JP server. We get hired to go against him to stop humanity from being erased, only to find out that it's been erased from the get-go. It was already gone. Dr. Roman, who is one of our main members and our medical professional, always showed a specific kindness to everybody, but he was real devout about finding out what was up with Goetia's plan. Because up until this point in time, remember, we don't know anything. We don't know why this is happening, why the world has been wiped, why are so many things going amiss. We survived the wipe because of a conceptual barrier. And that's when later in the story, we realize that God had a plan. God in verse sent that same ring that I mentioned before, the Ring of Solomon, into the future as a catalyst so Solomon could be summoned. So when the creator of Chaldea, who is Marsberry, got into the FGO version of the Fuyuki War, the first Fuyuki Grail War, he was able to get into this with Solomon at his side. And of course, it being Solomon, they came out on top and they were able to actually get their wish. This grail wasn't tainted. And so Marsberry asked for money, and Solomon once again asked for something specific that wouldn't be understood at the time, but it would make sense as time came back around. And what Solomon ended up asking for was rebirth. He asked for a reincarnation. Solomon, in fact, ended up being Dr. Roman that worked over us at Chaldea. It was one of the greatest twists in the story, and it's an even greater play on his background because, as I mentioned before, Solomon went out on a really bad note. As time went by during his life, he started to worship the lords of all these women that he would be with, and he got further and further away from the word of his own, to the point where God punished him. He stripped the tribes from him, and the only reason he didn't take them all is because his father, that being King David, kept his consistency. And so the reason why this is so impactful in the fake verse is because it's almost like the fake counterpart is getting a second chance at redemption. It's almost like an answer, something to succeed the testament itself, whereas Solomon, now reincarnated as Roman, can get a chance to show God that he didn't mean to do wrong. Even if he gets nothing out of it, even if he fails, even if all of it goes to the dam, he just wants to show that his heart was just in the wrong place. And so in the story, that's exactly what Roman does. It shows us that he's very frantic and very obsessed about the goal of keeping the human order, that it means more than anything to him. He spent every fiber of his being to make sure that we had everything in working order and did everything to the best of our ability. He would work as the active thorn in Goetia's side, and so Roman would help us go through these singularities all the way up until the point where we meet Goetia himself in London, in the body of Solomon. He couldn't for the life of him understand why they would try to put a stop to his plan when all he wanted was the betterment of mankind. But as we progressively continue through the singularities and make it all the way to his temple, something that he had to realize is that while we may have the same end goal, we operate on two different accords. So this 3,000-year-old plan that Goetia had put into effect all the way back from the age of gods meant that every human on the planet was absorbed and turned into energy, and this would be Solomon's phantasm, Ars Almadel, the same giant ring of light that you see over the singularities. All of this was energy conjured from absorbing every single human on the planet, which at that time would have been around 7 billion. So as Goetia, being a counterpart to Solomon, he also had that same clairvoyance, and he saw the end of the world coming. He didn't realize why it happened, he just just knew that the world would eventually be a blank slate if he didn't get to his goal first. Little did he know that this was actually the alien god at the time, but that was out of his scope. All he knew was that the world was coming to an end and he wanted to do his best to rectify it. So he was going to use his phantasm, these massive rings of light, to send himself back into the past. Not just back into the beginning of humanity, but the beginning of the planet, the beginning of Earth itself, in order to recreate the path and have himself become God, because he felt that his perception was more fitting. And later on in the story, he goes into a deeper segment about this, that our emotion, the way that we strive for vanity, as far as he's concerned, will end up just like Solomon. I mean, how can you not end up like Solomon? He had all the wisdom in the world and he still failed. If you can think about it and try to internalize where he's coming from. With him lacking that humanity, there was no way that he could fathom us governing ourselves and that working out. And there's more verses where Solomon himself writes about how he feels toward the position that he's held for so long. And one of the conclusions that he came to is that all these things that people hold to a high standard, they don't really matter. From Ecclesiastes, he says, "When I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. The wise man has eyes in his head, while the fool walks in darkness. But I came to realize that the same fate overtakes them both. The fate of the fool will overtake me also. What then do I gain by being wise? This too is meaningless." So Solomon himself is telling you everything that you could possibly think of, he's had it. The money, the fame, the treasures, the women, political favor, social favor, the materials, everybody loved him, and the wisdom by God himself. All of these different things came to meaning nothing. And he doesn't mean nothing in the sense of nihilism. He means nothing more so in the sense of introspection. You could have all of these things, but if your spirit is broken, if you're spiritually bankrupt, then you'll still be lost. If you abandon your people, if you abandon your identity, then what good did it do you? And it puts a heavy weight on the philosophy of what's important in life, and understanding that at the end of the day, we're all just here. We can make up any metric in our head as to what's better, what makes you successful, what's being a good or a bad person, but it's always important to keep the core values in mind. And this is that same line of thinking that you get from Goetia. This is the reason why he acts the way that he does. If the same fate overtakes them both, then what good is being wise then? Goetia, from my perspective, is playing the same role as Solomon, where he's wise to a fault. He's too wise for his own good. You know how the saying goes, too much of anything is never a good thing. So we get to his temple by the end of the story, that being the end of FGO part 1, and Goetia reveals himself in his true form, the form outside of Solomon's body, but he still maintained a part of his existence because they're tied at the hip in terms of mythology. Goetia tries to use his phantasm to absorb those rings of light and send himself back, but in order to do this, it will require him to have the 10 rings of Solomon to fully put the spell into effect. Goetia realized that he only had 9. The reason why is because God, again, sent that same ring into the future as a counter to him. It all comes full circle. And of course, since Roman was just Solomon reincarnated, he had this ring all along, and he was waiting on the moment that Goetia finally decided to do this in order to reveal that. And so when Roman finally reveals his true identity, he goes back into his original form and showcases himself as a grand servant, our first grand caster. And then he uses his phantasm, Ars Nova. Unfortunately, and in order for Solomon to use it, it also required his sacrifice, which he was completely okay with. So Roman, aka Solomon, ended up sacrificing himself in order to rectify his past on a biblical level, on a fate level, and as a human in general. Literally one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. I'm not kidding. And it also meant that he would be erased from the data books. He would no longer be recognized as a spirit in the Throne of Heroes. When he did this, you actually can't see his data. It was almost like he had wiped his own identity to the point where it didn't exist, just for us to continue on and reverse the incineration of humanity. In the meantime, you have the true form of Goetia as a human, that being the king of man. And you can kind of see this in the design where you see half of his body being part beast and half of it being human to represent that. Goetia originally being the beast of pity, he felt bad for mankind. He truly did, but he respected us enough to give Ritsuka his fair bout to fight for what's right. We end up beating him, and this is where his main story starts to come to a close. The difference here is that although Solomon got wiped, Goetia supposedly continued to live on, which we see later on in the Lost Belts when we see Roman's body being used, but we realize that this isn't actually Roman. And considering what he knows, why he chose to use Roman's body out of everybody, it could only be Goetia. So in a way, it once again flips where you have Goetia repenting, even as a beast of humanity, even though he was just doing what he was supposed to do as an antagonist, as this lookout for mankind. He is now giving us pointers and saving us in places where things could have went really bad, just to show how grateful he is. So to answer Soleil's question, it was the FGO timelines that he was going out to get specifically. All of them. It wasn't just one timeline. Those rings of light embodied infinite timelines and infinite possibilities. That was the whole point, but that never went outside FGO. So everything is connected as far as Grand Order goes, but that's where it stops. You don't see Goetia trying to do this in the regular Stay Night timelines, or even outside of Fate in things like the Tsukihime world, where he could have done the same thing. It's all catered to FGO, but it's still super impressive, and it just goes to show how strong he was and how strong he could have been had those fail safes not been in place. And it also goes to show how strong Solomon was, since Goetia's power was just an extension of his.